An 8-year-old boy, small in stature but radiating an unshakable courage, stood up and posed a question that froze an entire town hall in its tracks. In that instant, the room's bustling energy gave way to a profound stillness. No one could have foreseen that this brave inquiry would inspire Donald Trump, a man celebrated for his unyielding confidence and larger-than-life persona, to reveal a deeply personal story. What followed was a heartfelt account of faith shaken and restored, of profound loss and the quest to rediscover purpose. As his words unfolded, they transcended politics and touched the very core of human vulnerability, leaving the audience in awe. Silent tears glistened in the eyes of those present, each one reflecting the depth of a moment they would never forget. The small church hall in Shreveport, Louisiana, felt transformed that evening, a far cry from its usual gatherings. It wasn't the familiar, welcoming space where families exchanged laughter over potluck dinners or contemplated scripture during solemn Bible studies. Tonight, the room seemed to hum with an unspoken anticipation, a kind of energy that settled over the rows of folding chairs like an invisible blanket. The polished floor caught the faint gleam of overhead lights, and the gentle scraping of chairs as people adjusted their seats blended with murmured conversations, creating an atmosphere charged with expectation. It was as though everyone could sense something remarkable was about to happen, though no one could quite name it. At the front of the room, standing behind a modest wooden podium, was Donald Trump. His presence, as always, was magnetic. The sunlit tones of his complexion and the familiar choreography of his hand gestures made him instantly recognizable, even to those who had only ever seen him on television. Yet tonight, there was a difference. The confidence that usually burst forth with every word was subdued, replaced by a quiet solemnity that seemed almost out of place. He stood not as the larger-than-life figure many knew, but as a man aware of the weight of the evening, as if he, too, was bracing for what was to come. The audience reflected the community, a mix of faces and ages, young families with restless children in tow, elderly couples leaning close as they whispered to each other, and a smattering of curious locals drawn by the opportunity to see Trump in such an intimate setting. The hum of quiet conversations filled the room as people speculated about what he might say. Yet amid the sea of faces, one stood out, not because of size, status, or recognition, but because of an intangible presence that seemed to radiate from him. Seated about halfway back in the hall was an 8-year-old boy named Liam. He was small for his age, his feet barely touching the floor as he perched on his chair, dressed in a neatly pressed shirt and a pair of slacks that his mother had chosen with care. He looked every bit the picture of a well-mannered child at a Sunday gathering, but it was the object in his hands that seemed to define him at that moment, a worn, leather-bound Bible, its once bright gold lettering now faded with time. The edges of the pages were soft and frayed, evidence of years of use. It wasn't just a book to Liam. It was a treasure, a gift from his late grandmother, who had told him stories of faith and love from its pages. To him, it was more than a keepsake. It was a connection to her memory, a guidepost he carried with him. Before they had entered the hall, Liam's mother had knelt beside him in the car, her hands resting lightly on his small shoulders. Her voice was gentle but firm, her eyes searching his as she said, "You can ask your question, sweetheart, but only if you're sure. Only if it's something you truly want to know." Liam had nodded, his resolve clear despite the nervous rhythm of his breathing. For weeks, he had been preparing for this moment. On the playground during recess, while other children chased each other in games of tag, Liam sat with a small, dog-eared notebook, carefully writing and rewriting the question he wanted to ask. At night, as he lay in bed, the question played over and over in his mind, a mantra whispered softly into the darkness. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment whim or a fleeting curiosity. It was a question that had grown in his heart, heavy with meaning, a question so profound that even adults hesitated to ask it. As the room settled and Trump began to speak, Liam sat quietly, his small hands clutching the Bible like a talisman. His wide eyes followed every movement, every word, though his mind remained focused on the task ahead. He had rehearsed this moment countless times, but the reality of it, being here, surrounded by so many people, made his chest tighten with nerves. He glanced at his mother, who gave him a reassuring smile and a small nod. The room continued to buzz with anticipation, but Liam sat still, his small frame holding an intensity far beyond his years. He wasn't just waiting for his turn to speak. He was waiting for the moment to release the question that had been with him for so long. The question that carried all the weight of a young boy's hope, doubt, and longing. And as Trump's words filled the hall, Liam gripped his Bible tighter, his heart pounding in time with a moment he knew would change him forever. The evening unfolded much as one might expect, with Donald Trump addressing the audience on familiar topics, policies he championed, accomplishments he was proud of, and bold visions for America's future. The audience, seated in neat rows on folding chairs, listened attentively, their reactions polite and measured. Nods of agreement punctuated his points, and occasional applause rippled through the hall. But it was subdued compared to the thunderous energy of Trump's larger rallies. The event seemed to be following a predictable rhythm, steady and controlled, with little room for surprises. The Q&A session began. As Trump invited questions from the audience, a line quickly formed. People stepped forward one by one to voice their concerns about local issues, ask about national policies, or offer glowing compliments. Each question was met with Trump's characteristic confidence, his responses crisp and unwavering. Yet Liam barely heard them. His small shoulders seemed to tense with each passing moment, the anticipation building inside him like a storm. He lowered his head slightly, as if retreating under the weight of the task he had set for himself. Then came the gentle touch of his mother's hand on his arm, a silent nudge of encouragement. Liam lifted his head, his wide eyes meeting hers. She gave him a warm, reassuring smile that said, "You can do this." His chest rose and fell with a deep breath as he summoned every ounce of courage he had. He stood slowly, his hands gripping the Bible even tighter, as though drawing strength from its familiar feel. Liam's legs felt unsteady as he approached the line of people waiting to speak. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the weight of the moment seemed to press down on him. He was aware of the eyes that began to follow him. First a few curious glances, then dozens more as the room noticed the small boy weaving his way to the microphone. His heart thundered in his chest, so loud he was certain everyone could hear it. But he kept moving, one step at a time. As Liam reached the microphone, he found himself standing closer to Donald Trump than he ever imagined. Trump, mid-answer to the previous question, turned his gaze toward the boy. His expression shifted subtly, from the confident assertiveness of a public figure to something softer, curiosity mixed with warmth. For a man who had faced countless cameras and questions, this moment seemed to catch even him off guard. "What would you like to ask, young man?" Trump said, his voice unexpectedly gentle, carrying a tone that was rare for him. It was not the booming cadence of a rally or the brisk authority of a debate. It was quiet, almost tender, as though he instinctively understood that this boy carried something important. Liam's hands tightened around the Bible, his knuckles whitening as he took another deep breath. The microphone, towering over his small stature, seemed daunting, but he leaned forward slightly and spoke. His voice wavered at first, but his determination steadied it. "Mr. Trump," he began, pausing as the words formed clearly in his mind. "What does God mean to you?" The question hung in the air like an invisible weight, silencing the room in an instant. The soft murmurs of the audience stopped, and even the occasional creak of a shifting chair ceased. It was as though time itself had paused. Every face turned toward the stage, eyes locked on Trump, waiting for his response. Trump stood motionless, his gaze fixed on Liam. His eyes drifted briefly to the worn Bible the boy held so tightly, the faded leather catching the light. The silence stretched, but it wasn't an uncomfortable one. It was heavy with significance, as though Trump was searching through the layers of his own life for an answer that would be worthy of the boy's question. For a man known for his rapid-fire retorts and unwavering confidence, the pause was striking. Something in his expression softened, a flicker of emotion crossing his face that few had ever seen. The man at the podium, so often larger than life, seemed to shrink into something more human, more vulnerable. In that moment, Trump was no longer the politician or public figure. He was simply a man confronted with a question that reached into the very core of existence. The audience watched, breathless, as the weight of the boy's words resonated through the hall, creating a connection between the man and the child that transcended the space between them. Trump took a deep, deliberate breath before he began to answer. The usual commanding resonance of his voice softened into something deeper, something more reflective. The room seemed to draw closer, every ear straining to catch his words. For a man whose persona often exuded unwavering confidence, there was a weight to this moment that no one could ignore. "That's a big question," he began, his eyes locking directly onto Liam's. His tone carried a gravity that many had never heard from him before. "And it's not a question I've always had the answer to." The confession landed like a ripple through the hall. This was not the quick-witted, unflappable Trump the crowd had expected. This was something different, something real. He paused, his gaze drifting for a moment, as though reaching back through the years to a distant memory. "When I was your age," he continued, his voice softening even further, "I had a lot of questions about God too. My parents took me to church every Sunday. Without fail, I can still see those long, wooden pews in my mind, polished smooth from years of use. I remember sitting there, staring up at the stained glass windows as the sunlight streamed through them, casting colors on the walls. It was beautiful, but even in those moments, I would sit there asking myself, is God really listening to me?" He paused again, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the podium, as if the physical touch grounded him in the vulnerability of what he was about to say. The crowd remained utterly still, their collective breath almost inaudible as they leaned into his words. Trump's eyes swept across the audience briefly, then returned to Liam, who stood motionless, his small hands clutching the Bible tightly. "My father," Trump said, his tone shifting slightly, carrying a note of warmth, "used to tell me that faith is like a ladder. He'd say, you climb it one rung at a time. Sometimes it feels steady, and other times it shakes so much you think you're going to fall. But you have to keep climbing, because there's something at the top that's worth reaching for." The faintest smile crossed Trump's face, a mix of nostalgia and understanding. His gaze softened as he looked at Liam. "Back then," he admitted, "I didn't really understand what he meant. I thought he was just saying it to keep me from asking too many hard questions." The audience chuckled softly at the admission, a brief ripple of lightness that momentarily eased the tension in the room. But Liam didn't laugh. His wide, earnest eyes stayed fixed on Trump, unblinking, as though trying to absorb every word. Trump continued, his tone now carrying a warmth that felt unexpectedly personal. "As I grew older, though, life taught me lessons I couldn't understand as a child. I faced losses that shook me to my core. I faced failures, some of them very public, and moments where I wasn't sure I could keep going. In those times, I didn't always feel God's presence. In fact, there were moments when I was angry with him. I thought he had abandoned me. Other times, I even wondered if he was there at all. His voice faltered slightly, a shadow of sadness crossing his expression as he paused. The audience could feel the weight of his words, the unspoken struggles that seemed to linger just beneath the surface of his carefully curated persona. But Trump's voice steadied as he turned his gaze back to Liam, and his expression brightened ever so slightly, as though recalling something he hadn't thought of in years. "It was in those moments," he said slowly, each word deliberate, "that I learned something important. Faith isn't about always feeling God's presence. It's about believing he's there, even when you can't see him or feel him." The room was utterly silent. It wasn't just the kind of quiet that came from polite attentiveness. It was the kind that held the weight of something sacred. Every face in the crowd reflected a mix of emotions, some teary-eyed, others contemplative, but all visibly moved. Trump's words weren't just an answer to a question. They were a window into a journey, a story of faith shaken and rebuilt, of anger and doubt transformed into something enduring. Liam stood rooted in place, the worn Bible still clutched tightly in his hands. His small face glowed with a quiet awe, his eyes shimmering with emotion as though he had just been handed a truth far greater than he had imagined. For a moment, he seemed to be holding back tears, but his expression was not one of sadness. It was something else, something deeper. It was the look of a boy who had found, in Trump's words, a connection to the very question that had driven him to speak in the first place. The moment hung in the air, heavy and profound, as though the very walls of the church hall had absorbed its significance. And in that stillness, the bond between the boy and the man was unmistakable, a silent understanding that transcended their vast differences in age, experience, and station. Trump's story moved through the room like a gentle tide, touching every heart it encountered. His words, carefully chosen and steeped in sincerity, seemed to wrap around the audience, pulling them into the quiet gravity of the moment. As he spoke, his eyes softened, resting meaningfully on Liam, who stood motionless near the center of the hall. "You know," Trump began, his voice lowering to a tone that felt personal, as though he was speaking not just to Liam but to every soul in the room. "Faith isn't always about understanding everything clearly. Faith is about trusting that even when the world feels uncertain and everything around you seems unclear, there's a greater purpose at work. For me, God is that purpose." His gaze lingered on Liam, and for a moment, it seemed as though the boy's courage had awakened something deeply introspective in the man. "God is the reminder," Trump continued, his voice steady, "that even when we stumble, the journey isn't over. He's the one who tells us to keep climbing that ladder, even when it feels like it's shaking beneath our feet." As the final words fell from his lips, the room grew utterly still. It was a silence unlike any other, not awkward, not hesitant, but profound. The weight of Trump's words hung in the air like a delicate thread, stretching across the room, binding everyone together in an unspoken understanding. No one shifted in their seats. No one whispered or fidgeted. Every eye was fixed on the figure at the podium and the small boy standing before him, their connection palpable, transcending the boundaries of age, experience, or status. Liam stood clutching his grandmother's worn Bible, his small fingers pressing into its aged leather cover as if drawing strength from it. He didn't move, his young face illuminated by the bright lights of the hall, his wide eyes shimmering with emotion. Slowly, a single tear escaped, sliding down his cheek, clear and crystalline in the light. Then another, and another. These weren't tears of sadness. They carried something far more profound. They were tears of comfort, of hope kindled in a way that only happens when someone feels truly seen and understood. It was the quiet release of a question answered not with facts, but with truth. The room seemed to feel it too, the ripple of emotion spreading outward like rings in a still pond. An older woman sitting near the back placed a hand over her heart, her fingers trembling slightly as tears glistened in her eyes. A young man leaned forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, as though he was afraid to miss a single moment. Others dabbed at their eyes with tissues or handkerchiefs, their tears silent but deeply felt. Trump remained still, his posture less the commanding presence of a speaker and more the quiet humility of a man who had just shared a deeply personal truth. His gaze stayed on Liam, unwavering and gentle, as though he understood the enormity of what this moment meant to the boy, and perhaps even to himself. He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. The silence, laden with shared emotions, spoke louder than words ever could. Liam took a deep, shaky breath, his small chest rising and falling as he began to release the tension that had been building inside him. His grip on the Bible loosened slightly, his knuckles no longer white from the pressure. Slowly, he lifted his head, his eyes meeting Trump's, the light reflected in them, not just from the overhead lamps, but from something deeper, a sense of peace, a newfound understanding. His lips curved into a faint, shy smile, though a few tears still lingered on his cheeks, catching the light like tiny jewels. The atmosphere in the room seemed to shift, as if it had been infused with a kind of glow, a warmth that wasn't there before. The connection between the man at the podium and the boy in the audience was tangible, visible to everyone present. It was more than a moment. It was a shared experience that would live on in the hearts of those who witnessed it. The audience, still caught in the spell of what had just transpired, remained silent for a few moments longer, as though they were reluctant to let the moment slip away. And then, slowly, the realization settled over them. This was a memory they would carry with them, a story they would recount to others, a reminder that even in the most unexpected places, the profound can happen. Trump stepped down from the podium, his steps deliberate, his expression reflecting the weight of the moment. The profound silence that had fallen over the hall lingered, almost tangible, as every eye tracked his movements. The energy in the room was different now, less charged with the anticipation of a political speech and more filled with a reverence that transcended the usual proceedings. Trump moved steadily through the rows of people, his gaze fixed on one small figure near the center of the hall. All attention followed him, the crowd collectively holding its breath as he approached Liam, the boy whose courage and sincerity had brought the entire evening to a standstill. Liam stood rooted to the spot, his small frame appearing even smaller in the vastness of the room. Yet he held his ground with a quiet strength. His hands gripped his grandmother's worn Bible tightly, the leather warm and familiar against his palms, as though it were his shield and anchor all at once. His bright eyes, glistening with emotion, remained locked on Trump, unwavering despite the enormity of the moment. When Trump reached him, he paused for a moment, towering over the boy. Then, in a gesture that surprised everyone, he knelt down, lowering himself to Liam's eye level. The movement was uncharacteristic, almost tender, and it transformed the scene entirely. In that instant, Trump wasn't the larger-than-life political figure or businessman commanding a stage. He was just a man profoundly touched by the question of an earnest child. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, the silence deepening as if even time had paused to witness what would unfold. "Thank you, Liam," Trump said, his voice low and steady, carrying a sincerity that resonated through the room. His eyes held the boy's with an intensity that spoke of genuine admiration. "You have a courage that many people twice your age haven't yet found. Don't ever lose that." "Okay," For a moment, Liam didn't move, his wide eyes searching Trump's face as if trying to fully grasp the depth of his words. Then, with a small but deliberate gesture, he extended his hand, his tiny fingers, still clutching the Bible, loosened just enough to meet Trump's much larger hand in a firm, purposeful shake. The moment felt intimate yet monumental, a simple exchange that carried a weight far beyond the physical act. "Thank you, Mr. Trump," Liam said softly, his young voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions swirling around him. "Thank you for answering my question." Though brief, Liam's words rippled through the hall like a gust of wind, carrying with them an undeniable power. They weren't merely words of gratitude. They were a reflection of the unspoken bond that had formed between the two, a connection rooted in honesty, vulnerability, and the shared understanding of something greater than themselves. The silence that had enveloped the room broke, first with the sound of a single clap, tentative and restrained. Then, as though a dam had burst, applause spread rapidly, building into a thunderous ovation that echoed off the walls of the small hall. The clapping wasn't just for Trump or for Liam. It was for the extraordinary moment they had created together, a moment that had touched every heart in the room. People rose to their feet, their applause mingling with the sound of quiet sniffles as many wiped away tears. Amid the applause, the reactions of the audience revealed the impact of what had just transpired. An older woman in the back of the hall placed her hand over her heart, her shoulders trembling as tears streaked down her face. A young man leaned forward, his hands clasped together tightly, his head bowed slightly as though he were praying. Parents pulled their children close, holding them a little tighter as if to share in the quiet reverence of the moment. Strangers exchanged glances filled with a shared understanding, their eyes speaking volumes without the need for words. Trump remained kneeling for a moment longer, his large hand resting gently on Liam's small shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it carried with it a sense of blessing, of recognition, of something unspoken yet profoundly understood. Finally, he stood, his gaze sweeping across the audience before returning to Liam one last time. He gave the boy a faint but genuine smile, one that seemed to convey not only gratitude but also respect for the courage that had brought them to this extraordinary moment. With a final wave to the crowd, Trump began to walk away, his steps measured and unhurried, as though he, too, was absorbing the magnitude of what had just occurred. The room remained steeped in the resonance of emotions that had been stirred, a quiet energy that seemed to linger, defying the passage of time. Liam turned slowly to face his mother, his small hands once again tightening around the Bible as though seeking reassurance from its familiar weight. His cheeks were still wet with unshed tears, and his wide eyes shimmered under the bright lights of the hall. "Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling but steady enough to carry his emotions. "Do you think Grandma would be proud of me?" His mother knelt beside him, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. She pulled him close, her arms wrapping around his small frame in a hug that spoke more than words ever could. Her voice, thick with emotion, was barely audible as she replied, "Not just proud, sweetheart. She would be so happy because you did what she always knew you could." The moment between mother and son, though quiet and intimate, radiated outward, touching the hearts of those who noticed it. People glanced toward them, some offering soft smiles, others simply reflecting the quiet warmth of the exchange. That evening, as the crowd slowly began to leave, there was a sense that something profound had taken place, something more significant than politics or speeches. People left the hall not just as spectators, but as participants in a shared moment of humanity, their hearts a little lighter, their faith a little stronger. It wasn't just a conversation, it was a connection, a reminder of the power of courage, faith, and the simple yet profound act of asking a question. The story between young Liam and Donald Trump is not just a conversation. It's a reminder that sometimes the simplest questions hold the greatest power to touch hearts and souls. In this noisy and complex world, the courage to ask profound questions about faith, about the meaning of life, is rare and precious. Always remember, faith is not about understanding everything clearly, but about trusting in something greater, even when you can't yet see it. It is the strength to stand firm when everything around you seems unsteady. It is the small but enduring flame that lights your path as you navigate life's challenges and darkness. And if someone in your life needs a little faith, a little hope, be the one to inspire them. Sometimes, a single question, a kind word, or a sincere action is all it takes to plant the seeds of something beautiful. We are all on a journey to find the answers to life's big questions. Be courageous like Liam, always willing to ask, always willing to believe. Let faith be your companion, helping you overcome trials and find light, even in the darkest times. May you always have the courage to face tough questions, the strength to seek answers, and the love to share that faith with those around you. And remember, every question you ask, whether small or grand, is a step closer to uncovering the truth and the real meaning of life.